Hello, my name's Jack Tomaney and I work on the Mapping Archaeological Heritage in South Asia project, and I'm based at the University of Cambridge. What I want to share today in my talk is my own experience of going from no knowledge in arches to having a working local arches instance on my machine with a project and a package loaded. And to do this, I've put together a presentation which I've called Arches, a beginner technical overview from zero to your own arches instance. And I want to start by saying, and I think it's really important to say this, that I'm not a developer by background. When I first started working with arches, I was very much a beginner on the technical side. And I started working on arches about 4 weeks before I put together this presentation. The aim of the session is to walk through the technical steps in a semi-practical way. And the hope is that by doing this, this will make getting started with arches an understandable and a realistic prospect for people who might be considering using it. Some of you, hopefully, might also be complete beginners and are thinking about trying arches for your own projects. And my hope is that by watching this, it makes the process feel realistic and achievable. And if you're already an expert and you know all of it already, that's great too. This might just serve as a useful refresher on what those first setup steps look like from a beginner's point of view. So as we know, Arches is a free open source data management platform for cultural heritage data. It was developed by the Getty Conservation Institution and the World Monuments Fund in 2012. And as a quick overview, it's a software platform that provides some key capabilities and all the tools we need for managing information, creating, updating information, for searching and visualizing information. Arches is a way for us to quickly build applications and data integration. As it's an open source project, it can be freely downloaded, modified and installed by anyone. It's not controlled by a single organization or company, and software improvements are shared with everyone. There's a large community of users for Arches, which is great for the software as it means it's secure and sustainable. Further, Arches is very customizable, and this is one of the real benefits of Arches. It has a flexible and configurable schema, meaning you can decide what data you want to manage and how this is organized. Essentially, the main point being that you can create a custom-made data management system using Arches as the platform. When working with Arches, and especially technically, it's useful to know where some useful resources are. I found this especially important. And I thought to mention these at the start of the presentation as they will be referred to throughout. So on the screen, firstly, you can see on the left the official Arches page. This gives some good information about what Arches is, and you can see some links to Arches for HERs, Arches for science, lingo, etc. Secondly, I have on the right here the Arches YouTube channel. This is updated with useful videos from meetings and workshops. Some of them are quite high level and quite technical, but it's also very useful for beginner videos too. Then here, some more resources we have on the left. We have the Arches documentation website. So I personally found this very, very useful. I can't really stress how useful this was for me when learning how to work and create a local instance of Arches. So please take a note of this, and I really will mention this quite a lot through the presentation. On the right of this slide, we have the Arches community forum. This is a very active forum of mostly Arches developers, but also some beginners. So many questions that you might have, or you will have once you really get started with Arches, will probably be being discussed here. So if you're stuck, it's a good place to look. Finally, we have the Arches GitHub page. This is useful because this is where the live code is developed and maintained. You can see the latest updates, the bug fixes, and new features as they happen. You can download packages or raise issues if something isn't working. And even if you're not a developer like me, it's a great place to understand the direction that the project is heading. And I guess I also want to say that lots of questions I had, I found answers just from Googling them, because people have had these issues before. Whereas also not so much a resource, but also before the technical steps, I wanted to quickly point out the Arches glossary. This is genuinely one of the most useful resources for me as a beginner. In Arches, a lot of specific terms are used. I've put some here on the left. Things like resource model, branch, card, graph. And at the start, when you first start working with Arches, people will use these words assuming that you already know what they mean. And for example, I know what a graph is and I know what a card is, but in Arches, these are actually quite different things. So I found myself coming back to this glossary again and again while following the documentation and creating my own instance of Arches. And hopefully I now know quite a lot of these specialist terms mean. So hopefully when you're finished creating your own instance of Arches, you will kind of be fluent in the Arches terminology. I felt like it was completely normal to feel lost with the terminology at first, and this page is really useful for that. And there's an arrow towards the page. So these are the technical steps which I will be talking you through today. So I'll be starting with talking about accessing or installing a virtual machine. So some of you may already have one through a university or a cloud service like AWS, but if you don't, I'll show you the route for installing your own. Then I'll show you how to prepare this virtual machine for Arches by installing the required dependencies, then installing Arches itself. After that, I'll talk about creating a project, setting up the database, and running Arches locally in a browser. Finally, I'll introduce packages and configurations and then touch on what the next steps look like if you ever wanted to move towards a full production deployment. I'll only briefly touch upon that as this is a beginner talk, but it's important to include that at the end. So as I mentioned, to begin development of making a test installation for Arches, we're going to install it locally. When doing this, there are a few basic system requirements to keep in mind. These don't relate to the individual software dependencies. Instead, they describe the kind of machine and resources Arches needs to run smoothly. So first, Arches needs enough disk space. The core installation itself is quite small, so around 2 GB, but in practice, projects need a lot more space than this. And this is for things like uploads, backups, and GIS data. The documentation suggests planning for at least 8 GB of additional space, but realistically, you'll probably want much more if you actually want to use this to store data. I think in the documentation, it actually says something along the lines of kind of provide twice as much space as you think you'll need just to be safe. Next is memory, and this can have a noticeable impact on performance. So Arches technically can run on a machine with around 4 GB of RAM, which is fine for small test installations or training. For example, what we're going to be looking at here first. However, for production or serious development, having more RAM is strongly recommended as the real memory demand grows when you start building front end or handling search indexing. In production, for example, Elasticsearch may need to use up to 32 GB of RAM. It's also worth noting that Arches is generally designed to run on a Linux environment, especially Ubuntu. But Arches can run on Windows or Mac, but most production developments use Linux to ensure reliability and compatibility. And because of this, Linux offers the smoothest and kind of most predictable setup, and that's what we're going to be doing in this tutorial. Okay, so first I'm going to look at virtual machines. So a virtual machine, or a VM, as I'm going to call it, is basically a computer within your computer. It lets you run another operating system, so in our case, as I said, Linux, without changing anything on your main machine. This is useful for Arches because the installation works best on Linux, and using a VM gives you a clean, isolated environment to work in. It also means that if anything goes wrong, you can reset or rebuild this VM without affecting your actual real computer. For training or experimenting with Arches, this makes everything much safer and much more consistent. So for this, I used Oracle VirtualBox because it's free and it's open source and it works with Windows, which is what I was using. It also works with macOS and Linux. It's one of the simplest tools for running an Ubuntu VM, and it makes it perfect really for learning how to install Arches. To install the VM on VirtualBox, it's very simple. There's basically 3 steps to do this. So first you need to go to the Oracle VirtualBox website and download the program and then install it. Then you need to go to the Ubuntu website and download the latest version of Ubuntu. Then you need to open VirtualBox and select to create a new machine. When you do this, you get this window open up, and there's a few fields you need to fill in. So first you have the VM name, where you need to give your virtual machine a name. And then you have the VM folder, and just to say it's good practice to create a specific folder to keep your virtual machines in, because it may be that you decide to create more than one virtual machine. So you can see I've done that there. Then in the ISO image section, you can navigate to the Ubuntu ISO image that you downloaded. And once you select that, the OS distribution and OS version should be automatically populated. Okay, so next is to choose the specifications that we want our virtual machine to have. So remembering from a few slides back, we know that Arches locally needs at least 4 GB of RAM to run. So what I did for mine was I selected that in the base memory section. We could obviously choose more if we wanted to, but as this is a virtual machine, whatever you give your virtual machine, it takes away from your actual machine. So for what I was doing with my test instance, I was happy with the minimum of 4 GB. Next is the number of CPUs you want to dedicate to the virtual machine. I selected CPUs. This is more than enough for what we would be doing with Arches, so I would recommend to also select 2 CPUs. Again, the more you select in your virtual machine, the more this takes away from your host machine. Then finally, we need to select the virtual hard disk size. Again, we know from the previous slides, Arches needs a minimum of 10 GB storage to run locally. I mentioned the amount of space you need can vastly vary, and it really depends on what you intend using your local instance of Arches for. I knew that it was unlikely that I was going to be using it for a huge amount of data, so I allocated 25 GB. That's because we also need space for other things on the virtual machine. Again, this takes away from your host machine, so the bigger hard disk size you give your virtual machine, the more that is taken away from your host machine. Okay, so after you've selected the configuration for your virtual machine, you will then be able to see this inside the VirtualBox home screen. As you can see, mine is here, and you can see that it has all the specifications that I just chose. I can then boot up this virtual machine, and we can see in a window inside my Windows operating system is the virtual machine that is running Ubuntu. So now we have a place where we will install Arches locally. But before doing this, I think it's very important and useful to understand, and this is at a very basic level, how Arches actually technically works. So knowing this helped me further understand the process of what I was doing while installing Arches, and why we are doing the following steps while setting up the local instance. So we already know that Arches is a web application. We will take this web application as our starting point. This is where users access Arches through a web browser to either view information or add, edit, and delete information. Behind the scenes, this web application is built using a framework called Django, which is written in Python. A framework is basically a piece of software that provides the structure for building web applications, handling things like user accounts, pages, security, and database connections. On top of that, Arches connects to a spatial database for storing data and a search engine for fast searching. As I said, this is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but essentially all of these pieces work together as one system to make Arches. Having various parts of the system is why in the next slide we'll see that there are several different software dependencies that need to be installed before Arches can run. So knowing the basic setup and how Arches runs helps to explain what we're going to install on our virtual machine. So there are 6 software dependencies that we need to install. So first we have Python. So we know Arches is written entirely in Python and that it uses the Django framework, which I just said. So without Python, Arches simply can't run. We also have Git. Git isn't part of Arches itself, but we use it to download the Arches code from GitHub and keep it updated. We then have PostgreSQL with PostGIS. This is the main database that Arches uses. Then we have Elasticsearch, which is the search engine which we mentioned in the previous slide. While PostgreSQL stores the data, Elasticsearch makes that data searchable. It indexes all the attributes, so you can do fast keyword searches, you can filter results, and browse using facets. It also supports rapid map-based searching. So Elasticsearch is what makes Arches feel fast and user-friendly. Then we have two dependencies that are not explicitly noted in the previous slide's diagram, but Arches relies on. So first we have GDAL and Geos, which are two geospatial libraries. And then finally, there's Node.js, and this is used to build the Arches front end, which is something we're going to be doing a little later. Luckily for Ubuntu users, Arches provides a pre-written installation script created by the Arches development team. This script automatically installs all the software that Arches needs, instead of having to install everything one by one. It's extremely useful because it prevents things like common setup mistakes, like installing incompatible versions of Postgres or PostGIS or Node. And it also saves a huge amount of time. So what could take hours, it can be done in minutes with the script. So I've just put the wget snippet here at the top. Just turn on the pen at the top here, and this is just an example of what the setup file looks like. All you need to do is make sure you have admin access, or sudo as it's called, and enter that wget prompt into the terminal in Ubuntu. I just have a GIF of me doing this here on the slide. So it's written in Bash. As you can see, I did this on my computer, entered the prompt, and it took about 5 minutes or so. I think important to say that in my case, the process was very smooth, but I did hit a couple of issues, which you might have. I initially had some trouble getting the correct sudo access, as you're not automatically given this through your virtual machine. And then after I finally did, and I ran this and everything installed, I noticed that Git hadn't properly installed and had to be fixed manually. This did make me think it's a suggestion to make that it's maybe important to check that each dependency is installed properly through this terminal. For example, if I hadn't noticed Git hadn't installed properly, I may have run into a bit of trouble down the line. Okay, so now the virtual machine has all the necessary dependencies for us to install Arches. More detailed steps for this can be found in the documentation, which I've put a link to on the slide here. But all the basic steps were performed in the terminal in Ubuntu. So firstly, now that Python 3.11 Plus is installed, you have to create a virtual environment. So a Python virtual environment essentially is an isolated workspace that lets Arches use its own Python tools and libraries without interfering with the rest of the system. Once this is created, you have to activate it, and then you'll be inside the environment. In this environment, that's this code here. In this environment, so number 2, you can then install Arches using pip. This second command here, this one. Then you wait, you make a cup of tea, you sit back for a bit, and when you're back, Arches will be installed. I should have said Arches will hopefully be installed, because the first time I tried to do it, it didn't work properly, but I did get there in the end. So after installing Arches, the next step is to create our own Arches project. So you can think of the project as basically your own personal version of Arches. So a workspace where your settings, your configurations, and your customizations will live. The Arches core framework stays separate, and your project sits on top of this. So because the project lives outside your virtual environment, it isn't tied to a particular installation you used when you created it. You can take the whole project folder, you can move this to another server, another VM, or even another team. And as long as Arches is installed there, it will run. This separation is important because it means that when new versions of Arches are released, you can update the core code of Arches without overwriting your styles, your resource models, or any of the work the team has done. The project holds things like your database connection, your front-end assets, your permissions, and all the custom models and modules that make your Arches installation unique. It's also where you'll load your packages, which defines the structure of your data. So creating a project is really the foundation for building your own Arches system. So that's what we're going to do. I haven't done this, but I've been told it's good practice to save the project in the -opt folder, which I actually haven't written on the slide, but I've been told this is good practice because this is where it should be in production or in shared systems. However, if you're only doing this for personal use of Arches to learn it like I was doing, then it's fine to save this in your home folder on Ubuntu. To create the project, when you're in the correct directory, run this code. So I'll put the pointer on again. Run this code, and the project will be created. Obviously, you won't call it Jack's project. You can call it whatever you want to. This worked fine for me, and it was really simple. You can then check that the project folder has been created. Here you go, the project folder. And inside it will have all the necessary folders and documentations for your Arches project. Then we have to create the PostgreSQL database that will be used in your Arches project to store the data. It's very simple and requires entering this code here, to set up the database code, into the terminal. When you run Python manage.py setup_db, Arches creates a new PostgreSQL database, building all the core Arches tables, loads the Arches reference data, ensures the database is PostGIS enabled, and creates the Elasticsearch index structure. I guess also to say that after running this command, I kind of wanted to check what had actually been created in the database. I knew how to use pgadmin, so what I did was I downloaded pgadmin onto my virtual machine so I could just have a look inside the PostgreSQL database that was created. It's also possible to do this using the Django admin panel in the browser, but I had more experience using pgadmin, so I just fancied doing that to see what had been created. Again, here's another link to the installation guides because I can't stress how important these are enough. Okay, so at this point, Arches is installed, the database is ready, but we still can't view it in the browser. And that's because the front-end user interface hasn't been built. This step takes the raw JavaScript and styling files and bundles them into a format that the browser, sorry, my pointer wasn't on, this script here. So it bundles them into a format that the browser can understand. It uses Node.js and npm to do this. Once the asset bundle is built, we can finally open Arches in a web browser and start interacting with our project. If you later make visual or interface changes, you simply just need to rebuild this step again. So to do this, in the current terminal that you have the environment you created active on, run the Django development server. Then open a new terminal and activate the virtual environment used by Arches. Navigate to the root directory of the project and enter the following to build a front-end asset bundle. And we're here. Finally, we have a front end of our Arches project that we can interact with. You can now view the front end of this in a browser. So you open the browser in your virtual machine and you navigate to this localhost :8000. And then you should see the possibly familiar front page of Arches. And I have Arches 7.6.19 here. However, I'd installed mine and I was excited to have a look around. But when we go to the search functionality, it looks very empty. I've never seen Arches this empty. Not only are there no resources entered, but there's not even a map. And for something that's a geospatial database, I'd say a map is very important. Furthermore, when you take a look at the resource models, you'll also notice that there aren't any. So that even if you wanted to add data, there's nothing to add data to. That's because what you're seeing is the default Arches instance, essentially a bare bones framework. There are no predefined data models or resource types yet, and we haven't loaded a map yet. So as I said, as a beginner, the first thing I wanted to do is explore the software, but it's quite difficult without either a map or any resource models. So the next two steps, we will add a map and we'll also add a package. The map is very crucial. So we need to configure the map settings so you can locate yourself essentially. I'll brush over this very quickly, but as this slide demonstrates, this is a very easy step to do. The map is through Mapbox, so you go to mapbox.com and create a free account. And then you just copy the default API key and add it into the system settings part of your Arches instance. So you can see that I've done that here. So yes, this is the token from Mapbox, which I've copied and entered into the Mapbox API key, which just says this optional section here. Then you refresh the page and you can navigate to the search section of Arches, and now you can see a map, as I can see here on my slide. However, there's still no resource models, so we still actually can't add anything to the map. This is where things get more complicated, in the fact that we would have to design our own resource models, concept lists, things like that, which when working as a proper developer, you'll probably want to do. But as a beginner, as I said, just wanting to understand how to install Arches and having a go with Arches, that isn't ideal to have to create all that. But luckily, Arches have thought of this, and this is where packages come in. What's a package? I've mentioned that a few times. So it's a complete self-contained bundle of configuration files that defines everything needed for a specific type of Arches project. Essentially, loading a package instantly sets up Arches with a ready-made structure, so you don't have to build everything from scratch, as I said. It includes things such as a resource model, which is the data structure, ontology mappings, links to SciDoc CRM concepts. Again, I'm saying these things. You might want to go back to the glossary to see what I'm actually saying. Concepts and controlled vocabularies, search configurations, map layers, optional sample data, quite a lot of stuff. It's important to say that anyone can create, share, or load a package, and Arches provides several packages on their GitHub page. One being Arches for Science package, another one being Arches for HERs. But for us, we're going to load the Arches example package. So this is the GitHub page here, and we downloaded the example package. So to save us from having to design and create the entire structured data model, we'll load this example Arches package into our Arches project. To do this, we want to go back to the terminal in our virtual machine and enter the following code here. And as long as you have Git installed, which hopefully you will because you will have checked that, this should work fine. And when it does, we can then go back to our browser and refresh, and we can now see what's been loaded by looking at the graph section of our Arches project. And now I can see there are 6 resource models here. So these are resource models that are in the package, and now we can use them. Obviously, as I said previously, when you set this up for yourself, you will probably be creating your own resource models if you're wanting to use your Arches instance further for deployment, and less for actually testing and getting to know Arches, but more for deploying it. But loading from a package is a great way to start. If we click into one of these resource models, so I clicked into the heritage resource model, as we can see there. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the resource card tree, which is this. Shows all the data entry cards that you can edit. This is where you can play around as a beginner, adding test resources, editing the resource models, changing the cards, etc. By doing this, you'll probably get a good idea of kind of whether Arches is a platform that would suit your project or not. For example, here I've created a new resource. I've added a name called test name, not very imaginative, to the name card, selected that as a primary name type, and then I've added a spatial location for the resource in the spatial location card. I can then save this resource, and just to say it's a random location, I just drew a random square. You can then save this resource, and it will then be visible in the main section of Arches. So you'll be able to see it on your map, and you will be able to see it in your results pane here. So as I mentioned, you can then play around changing the Arches project. However, there are many more things that you can do to make the system suit your project. I won't go into these as it'll take far too long, but I'd like to point you in the direction of the configuration and administering Arches help guides. These can give you instructions and tips on making the system look and behave how you'd like it to, and running and maintaining the system. If you'd like to explore either of these in more depth, and I'm sure you will if you want to set up your own Arches instance, then the official Arches documentation has excellent guides. So basically everything I've talked to you and shown you today gets you to a working Arches system on your own machine, so a local setup for testing and for learning. The next step, if you like what you see and you decide to go live, is production deployment. And by this I mean making your Arches system available on the internet or on a network for real users to access. This usually involves web servers like Apache or Nginx, which act as a secure front door between the internet and your Arches system. These web servers protect the system, manage website traffic, handle HTTPS security, and ensure stability even when many people are using it at the same time. This is really a more advanced step than what I'm talking about today. That often involves your IT team or your hosting provider, but the point is that everything you've built locally today is what would get deployed to the real world next. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I hope that what I've talked through and what I've shown you as a beginner will give you the confidence that you are able to go from almost no knowledge of technically using Arches to be able to set up your own Arches instance locally. You'll then be able to try this and see whether Arches is right for your project. Thank you very much for listening.